So salt is another one of those dangerous thin ice places to go as a physician, because the standard of care is, at least in the US, is still less salt is better. And that I think our current US recommendations are for 2.3 grams of sodium per day. And that's based on preventing coronary disease and mortality in people with hypertension, which is a minority of the population. So the assumption is that in order to treat that minority, the whole majority should do the same thing. And so there actually was I think what's going to turn out to be a classic watershed study published 2 years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine by a group at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And it's based on data from what is called the PURE, P-U-R-E study. And that's a study of dietary and lifestyle factors in a couple 100,000 people in 17 different countries. And they did something novel around assessing sodium and health. Rather than asking people, so how much salt did you eat yesterday? Keep a record and write down all the salt you ate. And how much salt is there in that Thousand Island sauce, right? The sugar itself isn't quite as many grams of sodium, but you have to read the back of the label and measure it precisely. And people, particularly in real life, aren't going to do that kind of measurement, and it's notoriously inaccurate. So what the McMaster group did to assess how much people salt they ate yesterday, they had them get up in the morning and pee into a cup. Now, that doesn't measure all of the urine output for the last 24 hours, but they did the study where they took people who collected a 24-hour, carefully done 24-hour urine collection, which does reflect sodium intake, because we don't have a place to store reserve salt in our body. It's either in the circulation or the fluid between the cells, or it's out of you. And when they do that morning void, first void morning analysis, and showed that the correlation with the 24-hour urine is very close, then they got morning voids from 102,000 people in 17 different countries, and then followed their health statistics for the next 3.9 years. I'm plagued by being able to remember numbers like that. What they found was that the level of sodium excretion associated with the lowest mortality was not 2.3 grams of sodium. It wasn't 1.5, and there are some sodium mavens at our National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C. are saying we should all eat 1.5. It's even better than eating 2.5. The lowest mortality was seen between sodium excretions between 4 and 5 grams per day. Now, if this was published in somebody's obscure blog somewhere as an opinion, it would be worthless. The fact that it managed to get through the review process through the New England Journal of Medicine suggests that there is some credibility to these numbers. And there have now been similar studies done in groups of patients with mild to moderate congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure leads to fluid buildup in the lungs and edema, swelling in the lower extremities of the body. And our treatment for decades, if not longer, has been salt restriction and then use diuretic medications to make the body clear salt and water out of the body. And for those people, the rigid standard has been 1.5 grams of sodium intake per day. And what they find is people who eat 1.5 grams of sodium per day versus people who eat 3, with similar degrees of congestive heart failure, guess which group has the higher mortality? 1.5. And that's now published. So this myth that low salt is good and even less is better is, that bubble is scientifically has been burst. The problem is, how do we push that knowledge out to healthcare practitioners, who, got their education 20, 30, like me, 40 years ago? And that's the challenge: is how do we move this into the knowledge base of the people at the practicing level, patient-facing practical level. So that's the general population. For a low-carbohydrate diet, particularly ketogenic diet, it's been known for at least 50 years that there was a phenomenon which used to be called the natriuresis of fasting. Natrium, if you ever learned Latin, is the Latin term for sodium. And natriuresis means excretion of sodium is accelerated during fasting. And it also is true when you're in nutritional ketosis. So the kidney handling of salt changes markedly when you get into the keto-adapted state. It accelerates the excretion of sodium, which means you're even more vulnerable to the side effects of not enough sodium. So, when you're out asked, so what about salt, how much? It has to be individualized. But our typical approach, unless somebody has very significant hypertension or severe edema that hasn't responded to a well-formulated ketogenic diet, is unless that small percentage of our patients who meet those criteria, everybody else, we start with 5 grams of sodium per day. If you don't eat, if you have 3 or less, you will have all those side effects and symptoms that on the web is frivolously called the Atkins flu. And I guess Bob Atkins can be blamed because he really didn't get I've been preaching sodium to prevent that since 1980, and he put a bunch of our other stuff in his books, but he never really managed to get his head around that one. So 3 grams or less, you'll have lightheadedness, dizziness, rapid onset fatigue when you exercise, feel palpitations, fatigue, and pass out under heat stress conditions. I've had a patient of mine who'd lost quite a few pounds and looked much better in a bikini than she had before, and she went out and joined some people in a hot tub without having had any broth or bouillon that day. And every time she stood up to get out of the hot tub, she'd pass out. And finally, I get this phone call on a cell phone from the hot tub saying, "What can I do?" And we had to have someone go to the restaurant and get her a cup of broth. And besides lightheadedness, dizziness, fatigue, and potential for passing out, the other one is constipation. You say, well, how does salt prevent constipation? I should eat more fiber, eat more bulk. But the colon is an aggressive water recovery organ. And if you don't have enough circulating volume in your blood volume in your circulation, it will cause excess fluid retention from the colon and cause hard stools, and that causes constipation. And I've had people say, I didn't believe you. I was sure you were completely full of crap, figuratively speaking. But I tried it and it worked. And so getting enough sodium is actually a very simple solution. How much is too much? Well, if you look at the curve on mortality from the PURE study, even up to 8 grams a day, the rise in risk going up to 8 grams a day is less than the rise in risk going to 2 grams in the other direction. So there's actually a fair degree of safety in that range, as long as you don't have severe hypertension or severe fluid retention. And the best way to deal with those initially is to do nutritional, get into nutritional ketosis, and the natriuresis of fasting is far better than a lot of the drugs we use, the diuretic drugs we use to try to mobilize fluid. But that was a bit of a tirade. And let me ask the gentleman here what.
Oh yeah, before I get to my real question, I just want to make sure you meant, when you say sodium, you mean specifically sodium, not sodium chloride, but 5 grams or so of sodium. So
yeah.
12 grams of sodium chloride, which is table salt.
Yeah, sodium chloride is 40% sodium, 60% chloride.
Oh, by the way, I want to say,
So
I'm so going to get into trouble for asking this question, and I think I'm going to get attacked by asking this question. But what do you make of Dr. John McDougall?
When Jeff Volek and I look at fat circulating in the blood, we look at biomarkers of what the body has done with fats and carbohydrates that that person has eaten. And we see distinctly different divergent patterns across a population of people. And one of the fats we look at is something that, unless you eat a lot of avocado or macadamia nuts, is very little in the human diet. But we see in some people a lot of it in their bloodstream. And that's a marker of converting carbs to fat. Going the other extreme, if you see very little of it in the bloodstream, those people haven't converted carbs to fat. And there are about 10% of the population who can eat a very high carb diet, like the Ornish diet or the diet that Dr. McDougall promotes. There's about 10% of the population who could eat those, a very high carbohydrate diet, and not be converting carbs into fat, called lipogenesis. Those people are very well, by probably genetic inheritance, are very well suited to that type of diet. So I'm not saying that everybody, we don't all fit in the same cookie cutter. The opportunity here in the next 5 to 10 years is to come up with robust biomarkers of people's tolerance to the macronutrient mixes that they eat. So there are, a lot of people, if they're, in the US we have 300 million people, if 10 million of them can do well on a high carb, very low fat diet, great, let them go there. That's 30 million people I don't have to worry about. But the majority should not be advised to eat something that benefits only a minority. And so when people say everybody should follow my diet, meaning McDougall's or Ornish's or other, I think there's a certain amount of hubris there that's not justified. And I hope I never have a diet named after me. And I hope that the diet I have the recommendations I do make to people are based on science and are based on the individual characteristics of the person I'm talking to, rather than treating that person as an average, individual, of which there are very few. In the back.
Yeah, my question is in relation to omega-3 and omega-6. What do you recommend a good ratio of how much omega-3? I recently watched a YouTube where Tim Noak says he has about 3 grams a day of omega-3 supplements.
So omega-3 and omega-6 are 2 classes of polyunsaturated fats that are essential for human well-being and function. The kind of identification of these and then of essentiality in animals and then in humans goes back to animals in the late 1920s, and in the 1960s and 1970s we began to define the requirement for those. But I have to push back against people who said that a certain percentage of your fat intake should be omega-6 or a certain percent should be omega-3, because somebody on a Ornish or McDougall program eating 10% of their energy as fat, to get that minimum essential amount, could be a high proportion of 10%. But I eat 70% of my calories as fat, maybe 75. And yet I don't have 7 times the requirement for omega-6 and omega-3, so I don't deal with percents, I deal with grams per day. With the advent of corn, soybean, sunflower, safflower, cottonseed oils in our agricultural food supply, which are all very rich in omega-6, none of us, you can't eat an omega-6 deficient diet, no matter what you eat. Even if you don't eat any vegetable oils and you just eat pork and chicken, there's a lot of omega-6 in pork and chicken, and you're going to get enough omega-6. So I have seen cases of omega-6 deficiency in humans, but that was people fed a chemically defined intravenous formulation that had no fat in it at all. Omega-3s I'm much more worried about, because omega-6 and omega-3 compete for utilization and incorporation in membranes. If you eat a high omega-6 intake, then even what should be an adequate amount of omega-3 is not enough, because it's getting pushed down by all that omega-6. So typically what we tell our patients to try to get away from grams and ounces and stuff is 3 meals of wild-caught fish or credibly farmed fish, which means that they're using not vegetable meal but actual ocean fish by catch to feed, like farmed salmon nowadays. Luckily they've moved to more and more bycatch in the food supply. So 3 fish meals per week, and you'll typically get enough omega-3 as long as you keep your omega-6 moderate. So we basically tell people avoid corn, soy, safflower, sunflower, cottonseed oils, although there are increasingly high monounsaturated versions of safflower and sunflower coming into the market, and that's a good thing, but you have to really look for them. So the simple answer is fish. If you don't eat fish, you can have fish oil as long as you buy it from a reputable manufacturer who tests for methylmercury and PCBs to make sure that you're not getting toxic products in the fish oil. And for fish oil, 1 gram per day if you're not at high risk for heart disease, or 2 to 3 grams a day if you're at high risk for heart disease. And that's where I think Tim Noakes comes up with the 3 a gram dosage. And that can be bought at a very modest price, so you don't have to go out and buy really, really expensive stuff. That's a long answer, but actually when we work with the patients, participants in our program, we devote half an hour to an hour worth of time over the course of a year in educating people on the types of fat. And you know, it's hard to just say it all once people get it. So it's a difficult problem of figuring what composition when you're eating most of your calories is fat. And our biggest problem is keeping the omega-6 intake low.
Just want to ask a question on...
a little louder, sir, right here.
I wanted to ask a question on issue around supplements or adequate amount of potassium and magnesium on a ketogenic diet.
Okay. Adequate amounts of potassium and magnesium on a ketogenic diet. The first thing is I rarely have to supplement potassium if I can get people to do a couple things. The first is to eat 3 to 5 servings of non-starchy vegetables per day, because that's a reasonable source of potassium, and also, if they're dark green, magnesium. Because the place to see magnesium, if you want to look and see magnesium, look for green. Because the mineral in the center of the chlorophyll molecule is magnesium. So if you have iceberg lettuce that's pale, barely green and crunchy, it may be a good thing to put, you know, a nice high-fat cheese dressing onto, but you know, it doesn't have much magnesium in it. But so if you have the dark green stuff, you know, that's where magnesium comes from. So potassium, and the other is making one's own meat broth, bone broth, is also a reasonable source of potassium. The other is don't eat a whole lot of processed meats. So if you look at what goes into I don't know what you call it, here in Australia, we call them hot dogs, you know, in the US. And if you look at the amount of magnesium and potassium in a 4 ounces of hot dog versus 4 ounces of real meat, you have 4 times as much of the potassium and magnesium in the unprocessed real meat, because when they process this stuff, the drippings, the cooking, leaches out the essential minerals. So I don't say don't ever eat sausage or hot dog. I just say try to make it a minor component of your intake for protein. Our biggest concern around magnesium is, for whatever reason, people with type 2 diabetes appear to have a failure of the kidney to adequately conserve magnesium. And we see a lot of signs and symptoms of magnesium depletion, which includes what we call neuromuscular irritability. So people have a resting tremor, besides having too much coffee. If they have, when we do a reflex test, if they have reflexes that are brisker than normal, but the most common symptom that they have is cramps, either after exercise or at night. And when people start on a ketogenic diet, oftentimes these people build up muscle while they're losing body fat, which requires more magnesium. We actually make their cramping worse by starting on a ketogenic diet. So we ask very carefully, have you in the last few weeks had muscle cramps? And if they do, we put them on a slow-release magnesium supplement. Because giving fast-release magnesium as a laxative, it just goes through. We don't want a laxation effect, we want an absorption process. And we do that as kind of preventive maintenance with any history of muscle cramps. Because if your heart has a cramp, you die. And there are problems in the past with poorly formulated ketogenic diets that have actually increased cardiac mortality from sudden death. Not plaque buildup, but you know, the heart going into a non-pumping rate state. And so, again, we pay a lot of attention to minerals. I love the question. On page 80, somebody check me out, age of the performance book, not the low carb living book, the blue performance book, there's a chapter in there on fluid and mineral management. 79, okay. So there is a 2.5-page section in there on magnesium and how to manage it. And you know, I had wanted to write that chapter and put it in the low carb living book. We didn't get around to doing it, so I only stuck it in the performance book, particularly for athletes, for the muscle mineral issues. But it's probably one of the more important chapters I've written in terms of basic physiology, and you just don't find that in medical textbooks. So it's nice to have gotten that written and published. In green shirt in front here.
I'm concerned about oxidative stress, inflammation during weight loss on a ketogenic diet. What would you do to support the body if, for instance, you're getting a high C-reactive protein level? And I don't know if they're connected totally, it could be something else, but I'm wondering if there's something you can do. Exercise.
So if you have a high CRP level,
Yeah.
the one thing I worry about measuring one test, particularly CRP, is pretty much a butterfly in the breeze. You know, depending on which direction, you know, so when people go to a physician to get blood tests done, they're oftentimes not feeling well. And CRP will be you have even a slight flu, CRP will be 10 times normal. So if you have a single abnormal value, the first thing I would do is before I tried to treat it, I would retest it. Actually, the simple commonly done test that is a more stable variable, still will go up with an infection, is the white blood cell count. And that's been around for 100 years, over 100 years, and it is, I think, a more robust measure. So if your CRP is high, but your total white blood cell count is in the lower half of the normal range, I wouldn't worry about the CRP at all. And the other is, it appears to us that it takes at least 12 weeks of being continuously in nutritional ketosis to really get the inflammation process dialed down. 6 months. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't want to get into personal details, but you know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the other is make sure you add in adequate omega-3 fat, because it does have anti-inflammatory effects, but it takes, again, months to, because if you have, even, pick on me, if I have 10 kilos of body fat, I wish I had just 10 kilos of body fat. If I take 1 gram a day, that's 10,000 grams. So I take 1 gram of fish oil per day. That's like going out every day and putting a teaspoonful of ink into a swimming pool. And how soon does it take to turn it blue? It takes a long time. So the equilibration time for changes in dietary fat, they're a little bit longer. The woman behind you there, Pink? Yeah, that's an excellent question. And one that, I don't have that slide with me, but I recently actually made the slide to try to finally explain this. So yeah, one of the most common things that physicians measure in people when they do blood tests are called electrolytes, which is sodium, potassium, chloride, your calculated level of bicarbonate in the blood. And sodium should be tightly controlled in a range between 135 and 145. And we rarely see levels outside that range because the sodium in the blood has to balance the potassium inside your cells. So that they're two positive ions. You can't have a lot of positive of sodium outside and less potassium inside, or vice versa. So when you restrict sodium, the blood level of sodium doesn't go down. The body shrinks the amount of blood you have in your circulation. And you can tell when you look at a person because they look pale. Okay? And because they're vasoconstricted. And I give them a cup of warm bouillon and they turn pink. And so the blood level of sodium does not reflect the total amount of sodium in the body and in the circulation. So the simplest test is have someone lie down quietly for 5 minutes, take their blood pressure, and then have them stand up. And if the systolic blood pressure drops 10 millimeters of mercury or more, you've got a a volume depleted state. Dr. Lin.
Let's see, one of the things that could help me when I speak to my doctor friends about this ketosis idea is not really just looking at the 10-fold increase in keto and beta hydroxybutyrate levels, but looking at the amount of insulin, the amount of sugars in the blood, but also the acid levels within the blood for each condition. And it clearly shows it's very different, but I actually don't have a lid or a table that I can easily have. I wonder whether you might have it.
I'm sorry, the question is what?
Whether you have access to the difference between nutritional ketosis, diabetic ketoacidosis, not just in terms of the magnitude of beta hydroxybutyrate, but in terms of how little insulin exists in the diabetic ketoacidosis, but also the levels of acidity within the blood, so the blood pH levels.
Sure. You know, at least in my day, we measured blood pH in arterial blood,
Yes.
which is a much more invasive test than measuring venous blood. So we looked at bicarbonate levels, and in my metabolic research subjects, whether they're on a very low calorie ketogenic weight loss diet or my bike racers who are on a high fat weight maintaining diet. I don't recall, the number of total subjects I had has been over 100, and we've never seen anybody's bicarbonate level under 19. And to be an acidemic, it's 17, 15 or lower, and when someone's in ketoacidosis, their levels of bicarbonate are under 10. So we've not measured actual measured pH, but using the bicarbonate as a surrogate, we see ketonemia without acidemia, up to levels of beta hydroxybutyrate above, the most we've seen even with starvation is 7 millimolar. You don't begin to get into the acidemia where the bicarb falls into an abnormally low range until you get the beta hydroxybutyrate above 10. So we haven't spent a whole lot of time trying to do more invasive studies when we feel that provides adequate evidence of the fact that you could be ketonemic without acidemic, and that's what the buffering system that we've evolved to have, that's what it's meant to do. Sorry, I kind of talked around your question, but.
No.
Just approximately your 70% of fat intake a day, how many grams would that be?
For 70%?
What's your total grams of fat per day, approximately?
I don't measure it, because I eat to satiety. I let my instincts tell me what to eat. And we find it takes people 6 months to a year telling them to do that before they come to trust the fact that once you get the carbs out of the, low enough down that they're out of their intolerant range. And as Dr. Christofferson showed you, you eat and your insulin goes up and you get people off that roller coaster. And our natural characteristic, or our natural instincts actually serve us very well. But for me, we're talking in excess of 200 grams of fat a day. Because I'm eating less than 50 grams of carbs, that's 200 calories. I eat somewhere in the range of 80 to 110 grams of protein a day, that's about 400 calories, that's 600. I burn probably 25 to 2,700 calories per day, and all the rest comes from fat. And that's in excess of 70% of, and that puts me in the range of 1,800 to 2,000 calories of fat per day. And at the dinner table last night, we had this wonderful buffet and excellent foods, and some of them were moderate in protein. There was some cheese on the dessert table, so that was good. But we had to ask for a dish of melted butter to come to the table so we could all get our fat intakes up to the point that we wouldn't wake up really hungry in the morning. So I kind of encourage people to experiment with themselves. They can, you can do the quantified cell thing and weigh stuff, but eventually I think what people learn is when they get their carb intake down to within their personal tolerance and keep protein moderate, that the instincts you were born with are your best guide, and better than having a scale and a measuring spoon and all that stuff. Right here.
Stephen, are there any studies done on the impact of the ketogenic diet on osteoporosis?
The question is effective ketogenic diet on osteoporosis. The simple answer is no. there's a lot of opinion and dogma out there that the acid of nutritional ketosis will cause bone wasting. But in a study that Jeff Volek did looking at calcium balance in people, he found that calcium excretion in the urine went up when he put women and men with metabolic syndrome on a ketogenic diet. So if you looked at urine calcium excretion, it would worry you. But what they discovered is that gastrointestinal absorption of dietary calcium, the small bowel doesn't absorb calcium very well at all. So most of the calcium we eat goes through. Calcium absorption went up with a ketogenic diet. Not because they ate more, they became better at absorbing it. And so you would see more coming out, but the person stayed in balance. We were actually doing, in our 2-year-long study of our diabetic and pre-diabetic people in Indiana, we're doing DEXA, dual X-ray absorptiometry, measuring body composition, but also bone mineral density in this population over 2 years compared to our control population. So we will have real data. But you know, we're going to have to wait another year and a half to get across the finish line on that one. But yeah, it's a very important question. I think there's still answers, good solid science to be done to give you the proper answer. The gentleman back.
Am I right through the blood counts I was talking about? The only two I really should be concerned about, triglycerides and VLDL. Is there anything else, any other markers I should be concerned about in my blood profile? Is that the main two? Or?
In terms of coronary risk?
Yes.
I think the problem with VLDL cholesterol is if it's calculated from a standard lipid panel, which gives you measured total cholesterol, measured HDL, measured triglycerides, and then they calculate the VLDL from the Friedewald equation. The Friedewald equation is very inaccurate for either high triglycerides or low triglycerides. So having the actual either VAP test or NMR test and measure VLDL particle size and number is looking to be the only really valid direct test. But if the triglyceride to HDL ratio is less than 2.5, almost everybody will have what Ron Krauss calls pattern A, that is the low atherogenic. I'd have to just say that, stepping back a little bit, this field is in great flux. There's still a lot of mythology and there's a need for more science, but the neat thing is that this work is now seriously in progress. I don't want to say wait a while, but I would not worry particularly about the calculated LDL if your HDL is, for a male, is above 50, and if your triglycerides are under 125. And then there are people like me who have an HDL of, last time I was measured was 105, and my triglycerides are 60, and my internist says, I don't know what's going on, Steve, but my calculated LDL, by the way, is 160. And he says, aren't you worried about that? I said, no. Anyway.
Can I just ask your opinion? We see a lot of females come through the clinic. All their markers get better. Their insulin resistance gets better. Their blood glucose goes back to normal. HbA1c comes down. The DEXA scan, their body composition changes. They're feeling healthier and fitter, but they get really dejected when they get on the scale and they weigh the same. Can you talk to us about why that happens in females and not in males? Because the males just rip them, boom,
Yeah.
The weight's gone on them. And the females say, everything's better, and we just tell them, don't weigh yourself, because you're much better, right? But they come back to us and say, look, we're weighing ourselves and we're not really weighing.
And what do you see on the DEXA? Do you see an increase in lean body mass?
All their abdominal fat goes away and it becomes subcutaneous.
Mm-hmm.
So that's much, much healthier for them.
But what I've seen I've had an opportunity to lock quite a few people up in a metabolic research ward. They voluntarily did it because they knew they were going to lose weight. And I've had quite a few females who came in basically with relative sarcopenia. And when I asked them, so what have you been doing the last couple of years? I've been trying my darndest to lose weight. I've been going to Weight Watchers, and they're restrictors. And when they try to restrict fat, they end up restricting protein and to some degree potassium and magnesium. And people in the agricultural community, animal husbandry, who, if you were trying to raise pigs or chickens or cows and you want to build lean body mass, you've got to get enough potassium and magnesium into those animals, and certainly enough protein. If you're restricting those, you're going to lose, even though you're eating adequate calories, you're going to lose lean body mass. And I had I think she's noted in, there's a case study in here. She was in a group of people. We had them locked up for 6 weeks. We had them eating 700 calories a day. The average person in the group she was in lost 14 kilos in 6 weeks on 700 calories a day. And half of them were exercising for 2 hours a day, and half weren't. By the way, the group that exercised for 2 hours a day didn't lose weight any faster than the group that didn't exercise. And that was a puzzler. But this woman only lost, I'm sorry, I'm thinking pounds. So 14 pounds, not kilo, 14 pounds in 6 weeks. She only lost 7 pounds. And she was incensed that I'd killed her metabolism. Now, we were doing urine collections to look at protein breakdown products coming out. We were doing, we were feeding them precise amounts of protein going in, and that's called nitrogen balance. So we looked at how much protein goes in the mouth, we looked at how much protein breakdown products come out of the body, but we had all those urine samples stored up and we analyzed them after the study was over. And to our amazement, she was excreting much less protein than she was eating, which means she was, we calculated she built 7 pounds of lean body mass in 6 weeks in the metabolic ward. It's over a pound of lean body mass per week while eating only 700 calories a day, which is metabolically impossible. When we submitted that paper for publication to 3 different journals, it was refused as being preposterous. But it was valid data that she had relative sarcopenia, and so she basically lost much less than expected, but her adipose tissue loss was exactly the same as all the others in the group. So she didn't defy the laws of physics or thermodynamics. But we've seen lean body mass gains in people when they get nutritional ketosis right, which again doesn't make any sense because exercise physiologists tell us that the primary driver of muscle buildup in the body is, the signal is insulin. So again, this shouldn't work. But it turns out that there's another signal, which is called branched chain amino acids. We won't get into that biochemistry, but the body's handling of branched chain amino acids markedly changes when you go into nutritional ketosis, and it takes over from insulin as a body build or muscle building signal. So again, the laws are different when you live in the land of nutritional ketosis. The same way, when I fly here, if I rent a car, I need to learn to drive differently than I do in California because the laws are different. And it's the same when you go through this transition. So I didn't really answer your question, but yes, there are women who are very resistant to losing body fat. And I won't bore you, but there was a study of identical twins, unfortunately all males, done in Quebec and published in the 1990s, where they showed that the ability to preserve body fat, either by caloric restriction or by added exercise, is an inherited characteristic. So some people are just genetically predisposed to be much more conservative of calories when subjected to privation by calorie restriction or by pushing the body to expend calories with exercise. And that's why the women we had in the metabolic ward, when they did 2 hours a day of exercise over multiple weeks, didn't lose body fat any faster. Because, to our horror, it pushed down their resting metabolic rate. And the body became very conservative because it viewed exercise as a stress, not as a beneficial thing. And then again, that's an inherited characteristic. It varies from one to another. So when you see a skinny marathon runner get up in front of you and say, see, I run 80 miles a week and look how thin I am, and you should do it too, you have to ask yourself, am I his or her identical twin? Yeah. If not, I need to ignore the advice from a single person giving an example of what they do. So I try never to say, do what I do because it works for me. Because I think that's flawed advice, unless I have a clone or identical twin. Other question? This? Okay.
So my reading from your work and most other work that's out there that I've been able to get hold of, my interpretation is that it takes quite a while for your body to become keto adapted, but it's very quick for you to go the other way if you effectively fall off the wagon. So you have a Christmas day or something where you might eat a whole lot of carbohydrates,
Mm-hmm.
that you very quickly go back to being using the carbs as fuel. But why is that? If the preferred state is to be fat burning for your fuel source, why does your body want to be a carb burner? Or have I got it very wrong?
The question is, it seems that it's very hard to get into nutritional ketosis. It takes weeks of being very consistent, but one big meal or even one day of eating lots of carbs can shut it all off. The analogy I use is like you live on top of a tall sand dune. It's easy to slide down and a lot of work to get back up. Your question is, why is that? And I don't know who designed the source code for where we come from. But the figure that Dr. Christofferson showed of how many teaspoonsful of sugar there are in different foods is compelling when you realize you only have 1 teaspoonful of glucose in your blood at any one point in time. So eating a cup of rice, steamed rice, is basically a metabolic emergency if you want to keep your blood sugar less than twice normal. Keep your total blood sugar under 200, or US milligrams per deciliter, or under 10 millimolar after a meal. Can you imagine what you would do if you had a big buffet with bread and pasta and sweet desserts and so on? That's a metabolic emergency, and the body has to respond to that in an emergent way. And that's why I think just a day of carbohydrates, a holiday, going on Jimmy Moore's cruise and eating at the other end of the ship, the high carb end, not the low carb end, is a mortal danger to the body. And so it has to deal with that, with red lights flashing and claxtons blaring. And that's why I think you have that instant negative response to a high carb meal. So what we find when people become keto adapted and then have a lapse is not only do they feel emotionally bad, they feel physically, ugh. And sometimes our coaches have to ask them, tell me how you felt about that. Well, I felt really guilty, but how did you feel physically? Oh, the next day I just didn't feel good for 2 days. And recognize the connection between the carbs and that lethargy and impaired well-being and function, and then internalize that. And we get people to learn over time. You basically become conditioned to avoid the lapses because you know that how negative the feeling is going to be. And that then becomes a self-reinforcing process. And so you can't tell people not to do it. They learn when they do, learn from the negative stimulus when they do, and internalize that and turn that into more consistent management. And our expectation is, based on our experience when we're doing the study, is more than 50% of our participants will have sustained a state of nutritional ketosis out to 2 years. And in so doing have put their diabetes, not just reversed it, but the definition of remission is not your blood sugar is normal today. It's you've been 2 years off medication maintaining a normal A1C. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but it's not why that happens, but we know that it's negative, and help people respond to that information, that feedback, by avoiding having lapses. And the other is teaching them to find replacement things that they really enjoy. You can have delicious, unctuous, savory foods, and I don't like to get into this thing of this fad around, quote, fat bombs. They talk about negative connotations. But you can have confections that are good, but those are not things that people want to eat when they're trying to reduce body weight. Those are things that people could potentially incorporate in maintenance as long as they can control the intake. But I'm starting to preach, so stop. Right here?
What are your thoughts of incorporating a fasting protocol as a strategy to reduce your insulin? Especially, I'm diabetic, so in that context, in that therapeutic context.
So the question is, what are my thoughts on incorporating fasting, by which, there are many different definitions of fasting.
Well, intermittent fasting or extended fasting, like more than 24 hours.
I have a somewhat contrarian view to the current fad around intermittent fasting. My point of view is, from a metabolic perspective, up to 16 hours in any 24-hour period can be completely benign. As long as during that 24-hour period you get adequate fluid and potassium and sodium, because if you're not eating food in that time period, you're not eating potassium, magnesium, get enough sodium. Once a human being passes 24 hours of no sources of calories, protein, carbohydrates, or fats coming in, in order to maintain gluconeogenesis at least a moderate level, even if you're in ketosis, the body starts breaking down protein, the body's existing protein, lean tissue. And by day 3, and there are many studies published, starting in the classic one was by Benedict in 1919. So going back almost 100 years, there are many studies showing by day 3, the rate of protein breakdown is equivalent to losing 3/4 of a pound of lean tissue per day. Now, there's a popular book that just got published that says that protein wasting during fasting is negligible, even out to a month. And if you look at the quoted papers, they're there, but the data is misstated. And I am concerned that lean tissue losses, if somebody does, say, 3 days of fasting every week, the amount of protein lost in those 3 days is greater than the amount of lean tissue that can be regained in the other 4 days. And when Jimmy Moore, he's going on record saying he did 25 out of 30 days of fasting a year ago, and by DEXA, his body compositional change was 10 pounds. He had lost 20 pounds. 10 pounds was fat, and 10 pounds was quote lean. And one of his advisors told him, "Don't worry, that was mostly water." But realize that muscle is 75% water and 25% protein, so that that 10 pounds of lean tissue loss would take, at least under optimum refeeding conditions, would take at a quarter pound a day is 40 days to recover. That concerns me. And then the other risk of when somebody has been fasting for a prolonged period of time is when that person starts eating again, they are extremely vulnerable to a condition called refeeding syndrome. And this was basically became well known during the Second World War, when either people who'd been incarcerated in prison camps or had been abandoned or lost in lifeboats and had no food for a week or more, if they took pity on these poor starving people and gave them copious food, many of them would suddenly die. And that's called that's refeeding syndrome. And that's due to, we believe, acute shifts of minerals out of from the bloodstream into cells, causing a impairment of heart function. And I am very concerned that a fad approach to fasting is going to lead to major pushback from the healthcare authorities when we start hearing of sudden death occurring. And I'm old enough to remember something called the liquid protein diet back in the US back in 1976. A physician inappropriately wrote a book saying just take this liquid protein, which is basically gelatin, 3 times a day, take a vitamin pill, and take 1 gram of potassium a day. By the way, the gelatin is protein, but it doesn't, unlike meat, doesn't contain potassium or magnesium. So people who did this for 3 months or longer, and then when they ate, we had 60 cases reported to our Centers for Disease Control of sudden death. And those sudden deaths were not blamed on refeeding syndrome, were not blamed on the abysmal formulation of that ketogenic diet. It was blamed on ketones. And it shut down the science and basically put the science I'd done at that time under a cloud for 20 years. So I get kind of worked up when I see people taking liberties with the truth around fasting.
But if you just, because with the ketogenic diet, my experience of it is I just don't get hungry. So you're saying that if I base it on 2 meals a day, that would be okay?
That's fine.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
But
periods
of fasting beyond 24 hours, the risk begins.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that people can't do that. If your diet for the other 5.5 days of the week, if you're doing, say, 36 hours of fast, the other 5.5 days of the week, your intake is excellent, not just in terms of protein, but in minerals, that could be fine. But until somebody actually does the research and shows that has long-term positive sustainability for people. Yeah. And I'd ask you to look at the recently published book and where's the research that they have published. Don't misquote research that's been done on before. Show me research that this works to help people reverse their diabetes and reduce their percent body fat and keep it that way for a year or two.
There goes my strategy for Christmas. Thank you.
Steve,
Yeah.
can I just follow up on this? And this might all be something, because I love the question, because one of the concerns I've had myself, and from a research perspective, I've been trying to find some data, but you might have far better practical experience with it. My understanding of nutritional ketosis is that you do put your system into a state where your rates of gluconeogenesis are higher than in a normal individual. And the primary fuels for gluconeogenesis could be muscle breakdown byproducts. So in that situation there, fasting as a ketosis individual, are you potentially feeding that gluconeogenic pathway more readily and so therefore putting your lean tissue at greater risk? Whereas somebody who normally eats 24 hours of fasting, their gluconeogenic rate might not be high at all. So there's no drag on that lean tissue. Is that a false assumption to be looking for evidence on, or do you think they might be worthwhile following?
If I can try to summarize, which is if you're keto adapted, you're better able to preserve lean tissue against.
Because you've got gluconeogenesis running to supplement the carbohydrates you're no longer eating, does that mean when you fast for an extended period of time, there's a greater drag on your lean tissue that could drive that drop?
There are multiple angles of this elephant that we, guys wearing blindfolds, people are palpating. With prolonged fasting, 2 weeks or longer, the rate of protein breakdown actually comes down markedly. So when you first start, the first day of fasting, there's very little net protein breakdown. The second day it goes up. The third day it's at its peak, which is equivalent in the average person of 3/4 of a pound of lean tissue loss per day. When you get out to 2 weeks, you're down to 1/3 of a pound of lean tissue loss. You get out to 28 days of total fasting, you're down to 1/4 pound of lean tissue loss. By the way, only 1/4 of that 1/4 pound is showing up as urea. So if you're only looking at urea nitrogen in the urine, you'd only see what looks like 1 ounce of lean tissue loss. But there's ammonia and creatinine and others, so it adds up to 1/4 pound. But the point is, if you're keto adapted, maybe you're at that 6 gram per day nitrogen excretion rather than the 14. But people haven't looked at this. And until they've actually done that research, I think it's unethical to write in a book that people should, that people should go out and do this on their own. So I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying we don't know what the truth is. But there are reasons to be concerned based on the past history. You know, in my lifetime, you know, I've seen this field get shut down by misinterpreting the cause of deaths that occurred by a poorly formulated approach. And you know, again, one day when you're not fasting, when you're fasting and not eating, you're not only not eating protein, you're also not eating potassium and magnesium. And those are the two minerals, when inadequate, lead to the cardiac dysrhythmias and potential sudden death. So I don't want to blow it out of proportion, but it concerns me because I can't live another 40 years. Maybe I can if I, you know, we're like these worms in the agar, but you know, I can't wait another 40 years to have this come around again as a metabolic option. I want to see us capture this and turn this into, you know, life-saving mainstream medical intervention, you know, in the next few years. And so I am a little defensive about, you know, what other people think might be minor threats. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on that as well as ask a question, but from my personal experience, I use fasting, and I can put it in inverted commas. I use fasting in relation to chemotherapy because I found a person in America who was doing that sort of thing with breast cancer patients, and he was a reputable, recognised radiotherapy, I think, or sorry, whatever it is that they have. And he said if you can fast, but in that fasting you're actually taking in bone broth. So you're not having nothing at all. You know, You're getting your nutrients like your magnesium and then the purpose of that was to get your ketones higher or level with your blood glucose, so you're testing both. And then the theory behind it is that because the mitochondria in the cancer cells are damaged to the point that they cannot use anything but glucose to reproduce. Anyway, so that's the theory behind it, and that's what I was doing. So I just wanted to say that I know Jason Fulton does a lot of treatment with diabetics and fasting, but he talks about fasting using bone broth. So his fasting is, and I know Jimmy Moore's fasting was taking bone broth and kombucha in. So he was actually getting glucose from the kombucha. Anyway, so I just wanted to qualify that because I think what you're talking about is an absence of any calories in, whereas bone broth, I don't know if it's the same as no calories, but it definitely has all the minerals and that sort of stuff in it. And I found that I survived the chemotherapy, not losing my hair and quite a few other things, which were different the last 2 times I've had chemotherapy. So benefits for me were evident. But my question that I was always going to ask was, in relation to the performance book, so I'm also trying to be an athlete, and I am doing a repeat effort sprint type exercise, so it's not a long distance marathon type situation for me, but it's umpiring netball, so I'm a repeat efforts of short, sharp bursts. And on a day where the normal theory, so it's the whole learning to drive on the other side of the road, but the normal theory would be if I was going to a carnival where I've got multiple sessions in one day, I'd have to keep loading up on simple carbs because that's my sugar, that's my energy for the day. So in the ketogenic state, other than taking bone broth to make sure that, because I'm also exercising in Townsville, so I've got the heat component, so I'm doing the bone broth an hour before, or the bouillon an hour before to make sure my potassium's right. But is there anything else for a day of exercising? Like I don't want to be replacing carbs because I'm not using carbs, but is there something, should I be taking some MCT oil? Is there something that I can use to make sure that that's an efficient thing and I'm not going into a phase where I feel lethargic and I'm not feeling like I'm efficiently getting enough energy from my fat burn in that scenario? Because I looked in the book and I can't find anything to cover a whole day, but not a whole day in a marathon, a whole day of repeat effort, short, sharp.
Wow. First thing is, I think I've given you a number of instances today where theory turned out to be absolutely wrong. So theories are good ways to formulate hypotheses to do objective testing. And the other is we individuals vary one from another, so you know, one has to be careful basing recommendations on individual case histories, whether yours or somebody else's. But if it works for you, you've discovered something extremely useful. First point. Second point is Jeff Volek right now is running for the first time I'm aware of, a prospective trial of a well-formulated ketogenic diet as an adjunct to breast cancer chemotherapy in women with node-positive breast cancer. So we're not, he's not doing the study to prove that you can cure breast cancer. It's just in conjunction with the standard of care, by adding nutritional ketosis, do we improve outcome? And so again, we're seeing a crack in the armor now of some resources coming in that we can actually run studies like this. On the question of fueling intermittent exercise, I think a very interesting 2 cases that came to prominence recently is in the Tour de France, Chris Froome, who won, and Romain Bardet, who came in second, were both low-carb athletes. We don't know precisely what carbs they ate during, but if you look at the Tour de France, it's not the same intensity all the time, but it's varying intensities from high intensity, attacking in a hill or leading out on an attack versus in the pack with your domestique in front of you breaking the wind. But this is the first evidence we have from a major sport like that of varying intensity that a low-carb strategy can be a winning strategy. What we have seen is this works amazingly well in prolonged individual endurance events like 100-mile runs. So again, you kind of have to use your instincts to feel what's right for you as you do this. But people are finding increasingly that when they thought they needed carb supplements during the exercise, so they train low and low carb, and then during the exercise they actually consume carbs. People are finding increasingly that is more of a mental than a physiological necessity. And when they get their mind around the fact that they can actually do the exercise without carbs at all. So I was mentioning in the car coming over today, there's a German-born physician in British Columbia who's in his late 60s who has been doing a half Ironman every year for almost 30 years and recently went low carb and just out of perversity did his most recent half Ironman on 0 in-race calories and came within 22 minutes of his all-time personal record. And he was struggling to understand how that could be. The human body, when keto adapted, is remarkably effective at utilizing, and even a skinny person, the skinniest ultra marathon runner has 30,000 calories of body fat. That's a male, and probably for females more in the range of 40,000. So there's, even in very thin people, there's plenty of fuel there, and it's just, figuring out what it takes to be adapted, and then figuring out how little you can take in, and still, have the benefit of that. One more question?
One more.
Gentleman here.
Yep. Congratulations, Steve, on the FASTER study, you and Jack. But just before I ask my question, just put it in context. With all this longevity talk now, and obviously science is catching up in medicine, is a ketogenic diet going to be sort of centred off this new scientific wellness? And how can you describe how is that sort of fitting in with like the latest studies and what Leroy Hood is sort of promoting in the States with this scientific wellness?
I think the future is going to be individualizing nutrient intake to the characteristics of that person rather than the population mean, and coming up with robust economical biomarkers that can guide people. But, Jeff's and my guess is that in the US population, that easily 2/3 of the population can have near-term consumer perceived benefit that is self-reinforcing characteristics of a well-formulated ketogenic diet to reduce the burden of disease and improve well-being and function. But I certainly hope that we're not kind of leading to this idea that everybody should suddenly turn 180 degrees and go low carb. I hope that we can use this in a wise, individualized way to help each individual find what's right for them. And so simple answer is I can't tell you what the future holds, but I think it's really exciting that we actually have a lot of science coming to this. I'm thrilled that I came back after 2 years and Dr. Rooney says, gosh, you came and talked to us 2 years ago and it stimulates us to think about it in a different way. That's neat. And I can hope in not too far from now, I can retire and sit back and sort of watch all this happen. So I really appreciate your attention and your questions and look forward to doing it again.